Welcome to the July 30th edition of Linguistics You Can Use. I'm your host, Sonatina, and today we are going to do a little overview on the very concept of linguistics. So, what is linguistics? Right? Well, the study of language. That is very, very broad, right? So, let's get into the details of this study. Um, yeah, what are the different areas that make up linguistics, basically? So, as the study of language, it basically touches on every aspect of being human. Uh, so, I want to start with something that most viewers will probably be familiar with, which are the uh, we're prescriptive and descriptive, right? So most people are aware of descriptive linguistics, right? So that is what most of us learned when we were in school, learning the rules of our language, right? How does the sentence structure work? Where do you put the nouns versus the verbs, right? So describing language, right? Descriptive linguistics are people who make up grammars. They um, now no shoot. Well, that's true. I'm not. I totally the two words got a live streams, right? This is what live streams are about. Again, my notes are. I have prescriptive versus descriptive, right? That's my note I gave to myself. Why? Because like, oh yeah, I know. Like obviously, prescriptive and descriptive. I can just give a TED talk on that concept, and then I just go ahead and okay, back on track, right? So prescriptive language, right? When you prescribe a medicine, right? When you prescribe something to somebody, you're telling them what to do. You're telling them, okay, I'm giving you this rule, right? So that's where we go into, most of what we learned in school, at least when I was in school, was prescriptive language, right? The famous book Eats, Shoots, and Leaves, right? It's a guidebook on how to appropriately use English, right? And so this is a very uh, up until the 20th, right? Up until very recently, actually, prescriptiveness was the more common way that people or that many linguists, many people who were working in language, that's the tack they took, right? And most of that comes out from what we know, right, as style guides or such like that. Now, there's a place for prescriptivism in language, in how we use language, right? And such as style guides, right? If you are the editor of a magazine, you want to make sure that the editing standards for the whole magazine is consistent, right? So you have a guide, one of the famous ones, right? The Chicago Manual style, or one of the other ones. I guess I use Chicago Manual in college, so that's the one that comes to mind. But there's other standards. ALA is like that acronym is coming to mind, and I can't remember. I'm like, I mean, why? But I feel like anyway, there's other standards, and so prescriptivism has a place in our language in linguistics, but for the most part, right, descriptivism is the way that most linguists are going in terms of how we study, how we communicate what language is, right? We can't really tell people how to use language because each individual uses language so distinctly that the only way for linguists to really be a good scientist is to just describe how the language is being used at the current moment. And that's descriptivism, right? how is the language being used? And language changes every day in every person, right? Every generation has different slang. And some languages might seem more stable than others, but if you look into the nuances of, like I said, slang, of the way that people address each other, all of these little nuances have changed throughout the generations. And so somebody who lives now would not maybe get by very easily even 100 years ago. And, you know, we don't know necessarily how how each person uses language. So, okay. So that's descriptivism, right? So that's the basic sort of like two areas that linguistics sort of came from in terms of the history of linguistics, right? So, like I said, prescriptivism was sort of the first, right? The original grammarians were usually people who were a part of the nobility or the religious caste or whatever, like the highest, learned, whoever was in charge of organizing society in that society, right? That's who was in charge of the written language. So they were very much prescribing how the people who kept the records used the language so that everybody would be able to understand them throughout the years, right? So prescriptivism was the first branch, and it really kind of, I mean, you can make your arguments that it might have been both, right? They were describing the language that they were creating, and we don't know about, the arguments of this type that might have been happening on the daily throughout the different empires of, the people who were using these terms and writing them and all that stuff. So anyway, prescriptivism versus descriptivism tends to be two of the major kind of like alignments that a lot of linguists take. And descriptivism is coming to become the more popular one amongst academia, especially. So let's talk about academia. I'm going to take a sip of coffee. It's actually a combination of hot chocolate and coffee, because that's how I like my coffee. Oh, it's a good mix, just a little bit of using hot cocoa as your creamer. It's a nice feeling. So let us discuss the disciplines of linguistics. So, various disciplines of linguistics, right? And the fun thing about linguistics is that you can really have you can look at the broadest level of language or the most narrow, area of language, and I'll get to that. So, various disciplines of linguistics. Okay, so we're studying language scientifically. That means we need to have some kind of direction, right? Focus. And since language pretty much makes up, or it involves every single aspect of what it is to be a person, right? We are the language using species, basically, Homo sapien, the smart ape. So language can touch on any area, any discipline. We have, history, right? Historical linguistics. Talked about this a bit last week when I went into some of the people who started the modern discipline of linguistics. But yeah, historical linguistics is that, studying the history of language. Not necessarily just linguistics as a discipline, but that's one area, right? But no, like the history of language. How does language develop? Through people, throughout history, right? What were the first languages, um, potentially, right? If you've ever heard of Proto-Indo-European, you might have be aware of one of those recon not reconstruct. Well, I mean, it's a constructed reconstruction, right? Like people are thinking that this is how it might have sounded, the original language that so many languages on the European, Indo-European, Proto-Indo-European, that continent, like, that a lot of languages descended from this one. So linguists are, guessing all the time what might that original language have been. So there have various, you know, ways of showing off the way it might that they're speculating, right, of what it might have sounded like, and that's very common in linguistics, right? Another area that brings us to another area. So like historical linguistics, right? It covers a lot of stuff. We're just doing a little survey, right? So yeah, like I said, the next area, right, is an area that I happen to be more versed in, which is phonetics and phonology, right? So the reason I come here is because of the IPA, right? I was mentioning how uh, linguists write certain words that they have certain characters for to show that they're speculating of how the sound is for a a word in Proto-European, because we don't actually know what it might have been. And so in my kind of focus area of linguistics, we have the IPA, or the International Phonetic Alphabet. And I have a bunch of videos that you can learn that. They're old. Might be updating them soon, but you can still get good info from not great videos. So anyway, I'm leaving them up for now. And yeah, but IPA, the International Phonetic Alphabet, is a way for people who study language to demonstrate what a language sounds like outside of the general way that people write the language when they are communicating with each other, right? So, because as an English speaker, and since you're watching this, it is likely you are semi-fluent in English and understand the vast amount of quirks there are between our written language and our spoken language, right? So we have a lot of sounds. We have a lot of characters in our written language that sound the same when they're combined, or even just by themselves, like the C and the S, right? And that's true in other languages too, but English is notorious for this, right? Because we can our vowels aren't stable at all. Like one vowel can sound 5 different ways practically. So it makes it challenging for people who study English to know what it sounds like if somebody just writes it as a word, right? I sound as a somebody who lives in the Pacific Northwest, right? I have a particular accent in my with when I'm speaking English. And it is influenced by the fact that I've also lived briefly in the Midwest and in California, right? So I have language influence from various areas, but some more than others, right? Because I have lived in those 3 places in different, times, amounts of time, and periods of my life, right? So when we're kids, we tend to establish patterns that follow us throughout life much more strongly, but we still are changing our accent all the time, right? And we are also changing our vocabulary, right? Oh, well, that brings us to another area. All right. So before I get to that, though, I want to hop back to phonetics and phonology because that is, part of that, right? Like when I'm working with people who are studying English, I'm listening for their accent, right? Because everybody, even in their own language, has different ways that they speak. So somebody might have a more difficult time connecting with the rhythm of English versus the individual sounds, the individual phonemes of English, right? So we might need to focus on one area or another in order to help one person versus another, even though they technically speak the same language or learning from the same language, right? And that's true, in their own, right? They will, when they're speaking to each other, they will probably be able to tell me where the other person was likely from because everyone has an accent. So that's phonetics and phonology, and that's really, my passion area. And oh shoot, see, and then I went back to what we were, um, I was like, oh wait, I want to make sure that I talk about phonetics and phonology. But basically, yes, is a sound. So then we get to syntax and morphology, right? That was the written versus the sound, right? So how language is, what's it? Written, yes, but I'm trying to get a little bit more abstract in the terminology. How it is portrayed in permanent-ish form, right? In non-sound form. There's a word that I just am not able to grasp onto right now. Anyway, but syntax and morphology is basically how the language is structured. And this is kind of where the prescriptivists come in, right? They are the ones who look at a language and tell others, well, here are the rules, basically, right? This is the order that you put the words in this language. And if you don't put the words in that particular order, people aren't going to understand you very well, if at all, right? Or you have to know that this character, right, in, for instance, Chinese, is pronounced 5 or 6 different ways based on the particular dialect, languoid. That's a linguistic term that I think was popular or trying to become popular in the late 90s. And I was just reading a book that I cannot, variety, that's the term. So, which Chinese variety? My vocabulary, it likes to hide sometimes. So anyway, yeah, what are the sounds that this particular character in this variety of Chinese, what does it sound like? Morphology, right? So morphology is how a language is demonstrated, portrayed in some kind of written, chiseled text, right? And the syntax is the rules, right? It is from the Greek, and it basically means, what is it? Putting in order, right? What is the structure of the language? So, as I said at the intro, right, there is a place for prescriptivism because we do need some guides in order to be able to communicate with each other effectively. But we don't want to be so, um, what is it? Chained to those rules that we forget the real purpose of language, which is to communicate with each other, right? So that's where we get to our final kind of like major area of language study, which is semantics and pragmatics. And this is another area that I also focus in, right? So I'll get to that in a second. But semantics and pragmatics is basically how do we use language really? That's the crux. It's a very general, subdiscipline. Language, like I said, involves everything. So linguists tend to start very broad and then focus in. So how do we use language? And then we can add a lot of different secondary clauses to that sentence, right? How do we use language with our friends? How do we use language with our coworkers, with our family? How do we use language in a religious setting? In any religious setting or in a specific religious setting? Are there general rules about how you interact in a culture? Or is it a lot freer, right? Um, and that those terms, freer versus right structured, are very specific in linguistics because there is a way of using language in every single community down to the individual talking to the self, right? There is a way that we speak. And that's semantics and pragmatics, basically. What is, why do we use the words we use? I actually took better notes than that. Oh, there we go. No, I didn't. I mean, I basically was like, go through these, and then I was like, you know what they are, so we're doing live stream, so I'm being loosey goosey with my notes, and I'm trying to like see how effectively, right, I am able to relay the information, right? So you're getting it fresh, raw. It's great. It's fun. So we were talking about semantics and pragmatics. So starting with pragmatics, right? Pragmatics is, basically the practical aspects of how do you use a language to accomplish something. And the accomplishing something can be a lot of things, right? So a lot of things people start with a task. You want to buy some fruit from, a street vendor when you're on vacation. So you look through your guide. Oh, I knew this was going to come in handy. So you look through your little phrase book, right? And you say, can I find? Oh my gosh, I totally opened it to the menu guide. That is amazing. So in Danish, I'm only visiting Daneland. That's not right. That's what Hamlet said. So Denmark, haha. I'm visiting Denmark. So I'm visiting Denmark and I'm eating out and I want, but there's no fruit. I said fruit. Oh. Oh, there we go. Okay. Menu guide. These are all the words. So do I want do I want gruna bunna or grunerte? So apparently those are very, similar-ish. Like, if I'm like going through, now actually these are both vegetables. I said fruit, but I noticed these and I'm like, okay, these look good. So, gruna bruna, I think that's how I would say that in Danish. Green beans or gruna erte. I think, again, I don't know because I haven't looked through the pronunciation guide for Danish in a while, but that means green peas or creamed peas. Very similar, things. But if I were to ask for one versus the other, I would get very different things according to, what I would actually prefer, right? I love green beans. I think green beans are fabulous. I'll eat them in most forms, right? Because like they're just great, almost everything. I'm very particular about how I eat my peas, right? Like it's a very particular kind of food stuff for me, and it's not a bad thing. I like peas, but I like them in very specific forms. So if I'm on vacation, and I'm looking for the menu, and they don't have an English right translation, I maybe don't have my English, my phrase book with me, and I'm like, oh, I remember green, and I'm pretty sure. And then, as pragmatics, that's because that's where that's why I'm talking about this. That's pragmatics would say that, you know, my goal of getting a thing that I want to eat would not have been accomplished because I may have ordered the wrong item. Now, I may have ordered the right item and I would have accomplished it by accident, which is still success, even if it's an accident, right? That's the beauty of language. And that actually brings us to semantics, because semantics is what language means, right? The meaning, semantics. And it's not the way that you might think of semantics, in that, oh, you're getting into the, oh, that word in that particular definition, it means blah, blah, blah. It's different. It's that, but it's different. It's bigger, right? Because it's linguistics, and it actually has a valid place in our study. Semantics is the meaning of what we are communicating, right? And that is conveyed on many different levels, right? So this is where, we get into sort of my niche, right? So as I said, I tend to focus on phonology and phonetics, but I do it in order to apply those lessons to pragmatics and semantics. So, how do we use sound to create meaning? Wait, how do we use sound to craft meaning? It's, that's, I mean, I'm a linguist. I like puns. I think that I think linguists have a love-hate relationship with puns. I just straight out love them. I have no problem just getting all the puns. I love them so much. But like, some linguists love to hate them, but they still love them. Oh, I'm getting all emotional because it's just funny. Okay, so my focus, as I was saying, is how do we use sound to craft meaning, right? So it's a combination of phonology, phonetics, semantics, and pragmatics. There's a bit of the others, and I use written words. I use historical linguistics. I use language acquisition. What is a language acquisition under? It's under a lot, because that's another thing too about language. So, okay, that gets us to our next section. Okay, so we got a good overview of what language is, and we got some good examples of the different areas of how they mix up a bit, right? And if you have any questions, feel free, to hop on and ask, and I will address them, and we can have a little chat about these areas, right? Are you, this one area, like, call to you stronger than another? As for me, right, I know that, like, I have fun reading about the historical linguistics. I very much enjoy historical linguistics. I'm actually reading a book right now called Passwords to Paradise, all about how language influences religion. Another super, interest of mine. So, gosh, I distract myself so much. Okay. Yes. So, linguistic disciplines can come together in fun ways. And that is where I'm going to kind of split now into two disciplines that I don't actually really work in as much. So I talked a bit about speech, right? So that's I'm going to break language down into a different way. So I broke it down into the various subdisciplines of linguistics, right? So linguistics is how we study language. But then once we get into actual study of language, right? How do we look at language? Now, their language comes in generally three forms, right? We speak language, we gesture, which I'm a big fan of, and we write. This particular, communication channel has no writing involved right now. Sometimes I might put up things that involve text, but, I didn't want to do that this week, so I'm just, talking to you at the camera. So of those three areas, right, I generally work in speech, also sort of in gesture, right? My writing area, I do some editing, but it's not the focus of my linguistics work. So, yes. Hmm. Oh, it's already 10:30. Okay, so speech, gesture, and writing, right? So the study of language, it's it is the study of people. So choosing any of those areas can get you into any other area, right? And that's the beauty, right? How do we use language with ourselves, our friends, our family, our pets, or with like the unseen forces of the universe? All of these things can be approached from so many perspectives, right? So, we went through most of them. How do we sound? How do we use sound? How do we, the words we choose, subconsciously or consciously, right? Some people might have heard of the discipline or of the practice of code switching, right? Which is a phenomenon that has always existed, right? Code switching is basically what language, how do I use my language in or most appropriately in this circumstance? I mean, that's kind of pragmatics, right? That is how most the focus that I go into. Um, but we also can, change the speed with which we speak. And all of these areas, that people they dedicate their life to studying very particular things. And it's usually only focused on like one or a small group of languages. So, yeah, in the process of carving out my particular niche in this discipline, it feels so niche, right? I'm very clearly focused on the study of sound, specifically related to how different cultures use those sounds to indicate different intellectual and emotional ideas. Uh, yeah, that's very niche, I feel. That sounds like a very niche focus. And really, that is the beauty of linguistics, right? Even with that focus on such a very specific, perhaps some would say overly narrow focus, uh, or section of the language, right? It's that niche, even that analysis, so complicated, is fairly endless. Like you can study that combination of how you use sound in any culture, in any language. And since, right, language changes every day, uh, it's vast and endless. It's even within one language, we use sound in very, particular ways, down to the individual using sound in different ways in different contexts. Some people are better at this than others, right? And it goes to show you that language, while innate somewhat for our species, that's another discipline you can look into. Neuro Linguistics, right? How do we acquire language? Is it natural or is it nurture? Is it only because we hear, when we're developing people? But what about people who can't hear? What about people who are born deaf? They create language from gestures, right? Signed languages follow the same patterns of development as sound language. So language must be innate, eh? Um, and that brings us to sort of the final area of that we're going to touch on today, which are computers. So we have gone into a lot more of the, history, or I don't know about history, but like the the more classic people would think of study of language and linguistics. But, as since it is a human discipline, computer science involves language, and especially the subdiscipline of artificial intelligence, right? How do we teach computers how to understand us? If you know anything about how computers understand language, it's basically math, right? 1, 0, 1, it's binary. And we need to figure out a way to code our abstractness into this very concrete form. At the same time, we need to figure out how to teach this entity that needs concrete information how to think expansively in a similar way that we do. So that's, artificial intelligence. And linguistics is a very huge part of that discipline at the moment. Make sure I know that I have note. Oh, is that it? No, that wasn't it. So yeah, like I said, there's many different ways that you can look at the discipline of linguistics, right? At its grandest, it is simply the study of language. Since we are the language using species, right? It's how we organize with each other and create the, comfortable society that a lot of us are currently living in. It touches on everything. How do we use language in this particular area? And, yeah, it means there's so many more opportunities for those interested in studying languages to put your mark on the discipline, right? And because language changes every day, much like the land beneath us, right? Like the tectonics, that's tectonics of, I think it's I can't remember which ocean is getting bigger and smaller, but one of the oceans, the Atlantic or the Pacific, the continental blocks are coming closer to each other in one of those directions, and every day, like, but tiny bit, they get closer to each other, and year by year they can measure and see, and it's like land, planes, and ships and all that stuff. They have to change their schedules every year because of the way that the Earth is shifting around us so subtly. And language is very similar, right? So subtle. But then there's earthquakes, right? Then there's periods, for instance, like when, obviously the first thing that comes to mind, when the Franks invaded England, the British Isles, like there was an imposition of French on that land, and it drastically changed the language very suddenly. It's like an earthquake, right? But most of the time, it's like inches by centimeters, by tiny sound changes, by one person choosing that they like the sound of one word over another. And then their friends like the way they use that word, so they pick up that, particular pronunciation. And then somebody that doesn't know them overhears them, and they're like, "Oh, that's fun. I didn't know that that's how you pronounce that word." And then they just teach everybody that that's how you pronounce that word. And then all of a sudden, that's how you pronounce that word in 100 years. Like, that's how, language change can work. Um, and so there is no, really end to the study of language. It's endless. Um, yeah. And I'm going to say that's all that we have time for this week for Linguistics You Can Use. Uh, if there's a particular area of language that you want to have a little chat about, I would love to have you let me know in the comments or send me an email. Details in the description box. Now, I would like you to get out there and have fun crafting some sound meaning. Have a great week.